Good day. Today is Saturday, 27th September 2025, and the conflict between Russia and the West continues, and in some ways it continues to exacerbate in dangerous ways. Now, the president of Belarus, President Lukashenko, is currently in Russia, or at least he has been over the last 24 hours. He's had further meetings with President Putin. The Kremlin has provided a readout which is focused on the economic cooperation between these two countries. But Belarusian officials, including Lukashenko himself and his foreign minister, have talked about political military developments. And the Belarusian foreign minister has said that the Oreshnik missiles are now indeed located on Belarus territory, that they are there. It's not clear whether they're already operational, but probably they soon will be, and it is likely that they will be reinforced further, that's my guess, over the next few weeks, as more Oreshniks roll off the production line and start taking positions across Western Russia. Now, I ought to say that there are lots of reports that you can find in all sorts of places, and I had one that was sent to me in the form of a private email about the rather desperate attempts that are being made by intelligence agencies to try to locate the bases of these Oreshnik missiles. Bear in mind that they are road mobile, so they can move around from one place to another, and they can be concealed in forest areas and other places. Obviously, with the modern means of surveillance that exist today, satellites and electronic systems and all kinds of things about which I'm not going to discuss in this program. Over the next couple of months and years, the United States will gradually develop a fairly clear idea of the Russian deployment plan and system for the Oreshnik missiles. But it's likely that there will be a period of uncertainty and ambiguity. There will be discussions and speculations about how many of these missiles really are in service, where they are located. There's still unresolved questions about their capabilities, and all of this is going to introduce a further element of uncertainty into the equation. Now, the question about the deployment by Russia of Oreshnik missiles gains extra relevance because of a series of statements that have been made over the last 24 hours by President Zelensky of Ukraine, and which have been partially corroborated by reports in the Western media, specifically the Daily Telegraph, which, however, is probably getting the information from Ukrainian sources, perhaps close to Zelensky himself. Anyway, let's turn first to Zelensky's comments. And one of the interesting facts about Zelensky is that he tends to he tends to alternate between periods of extreme euphoria, as he did in the immediate aftermath of his meeting with Trump in New York. Periods of euphoria are followed by periods, well, maybe not of depression, but certainly of much lower spirits. And I got the sense that yesterday was a case of Zelensky back on lower spirits again. He said he made comments in which he effectively admitted that Ukraine is not winning the war. Bear in mind, the Ukrainians themselves have been claiming that they have been winning the war for some time. General Kellogg has told everybody that Ukraine is winning the war, and as I've discussed on this channel, and as we've discussed, Alex Christoforou and I on the Duran. There's no doubt that General Kellogg has been getting this information from the Ukrainians. Anyway, yesterday, Zelensky admitted the obvious. Ukraine is not actually winning the war. He, in fact, gave the impression that he thought that Ukraine was probably losing the war, which, in fact, is true. Anyway, he said that the war is not being won, that Ukraine cannot sustain itself indefinitely under the kind of pressure it is currently under. And again, he talked about long-range missiles. And this is where the question of long-range missiles and perhaps the Oreshnik as well comes into play. Because what Zelensky essentially was talking about was about a request that he has made to President Trump of the United States. And we're told that he has made this request many times, but he apparently repeated it over the course of the 7-minute meeting he had with Trump in New York. He specifically asked Trump for Tomahawk cruise missiles to be supplied to Ukraine so that they can attack positions deep inside Russia. And Zelensky, in earlier comments, has floated the possibility that Ukraine might launch deep strikes against Russia, very deep strikes against Russia, especially if the Russians carry out a complete blackout of Ukraine's energy system. And, well, the kind of strikes that he appears to be talking about are strikes to be conducted with Tomahawk cruise missiles. Now, we're told that Trump seemed to be open to the idea when he spoke with Zelensky, and that might have been part of the reason for Zelensky's post-meeting with Trump euphoria. But as I've discussed in several places now, one of the realities about Donald Trump, one of the things that Trump repeatedly does, Eldar Mamedov discussed the point also in his article in Responsible Statecraft that I discussed yesterday, is that he strings people along. So yes, he apparently didn't reject the idea of supplying Ukraine with Tomahawk cruise missiles outright, but he didn't commit to providing them either. And the Ukrainians are constantly played by Trump and by the administration on this issue. And, well, it seems unlikely that President Trump is going to change his stance here. I don't personally think that the Tomahawk cruise missiles are ever going to be supplied. And there are reasons for this. And one of those reasons, and I will just itemize the others as well, but one of those reasons surely is the deployment of the Oreshnik system in Belarus and before long in number in Western Russia. Because yes, the Tomahawk cruise missile has the potential to strike targets across Russia, and it is a relatively stealthy missile, and it is a missile that can probably penetrate to some extent some Russian air defenses and can cause some damage. But it is a system that the Russians are familiar with and are able to shoot down. And I suspect that their air defense system, which is designed around the task of shooting down specifically the Tomahawk missile, will be focused on destroying it, not just when it is launched into Russia itself using air defense missiles, but destroying it from its launchers on the ground. And if we're talking about launchers, then these come in two forms. They come in forms of the large bunker-type complexes very difficult, very time consuming to build, probably vulnerable as well to attacks by Oreshnik systems, just to say. But the other system, of course, is the Typhon, which is mobile, but is enormous. Ukraine is a big country, but the Russians can probably, especially after a launch of Tomahawk missiles, they can probably work out the launch point. The Russians have been steadily increasing the level of their satellite coverage of Ukraine over the last 3.5 years. And though they probably don't have the comprehensive cover that the Americans do, at least of Western Russia, their coverage over Ukrainian territory is now much greater than it was. So anyway, the Typhon system, if you see the pictures, is enormous. It is very bulky. It is almost certainly limited to road use. The Russians would be able to track and attack these systems as well on the ground. They might very well use Oreshniks or other hypersonic missiles like Kinzhals and ground-launched Iskander missiles and even Zircon cruise missiles to attack it. This is a very bulky, very expensive, very complex system. It is in relatively short supply, and I don't think the Americans would want to risk its destruction in Ukraine in that kind of way. Beyond that, and this is of course where it becomes a really sensitive issue, the Tomahawk is a strategic system. It is nuclear capable, launching Tomahawk cruise missiles deep inside Russia would massively lower the thresholds, the nuclear response thresholds. The Russians would have uncertainty whether a Tomahawk missile, which was being launched against them, was carrying a nuclear warhead or not. They might not even be completely sure whether it was being launched from the territory of Ukraine or from somewhere else. They might feel that it is urgent for them to retaliate. And if they do retaliate, they have the Oreshnik, a much more powerful system in some respects, certainly in its conventional form, and one against which there is no effective air defense. The Tomahawks can be shot down. The Oreshniks, there is no system in existence that can shoot them down at the present time. Anyway, it's not impossible that if we start to see Tomahawks being launched against targets in Russia, the Russians will retaliate with their Oreshnik systems, not just against missile positions in Ukraine, but given the extraordinary level of escalation, if Ukraine were to be supplied with these systems, with the Tomahawks, which are strategic systems, the Russians might decide that the point has come to start launching attacks against targets in Europe. And with the Oreshnik, they have the capability to do it. So I think that these discussions are probably taking place in the United States now. I suspect that people like Elbridge Colby and other people, Pete Hegseth, some of the military people in the Pentagon as well, are probably advising the president that this is an extremely bad idea. Biden and his team were often given the same kind of advice by the experts in the Pentagon. They were repeatedly told, don't supply Ukraine with ATACMS missiles, don't greenlight the supply of F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine. With the Biden administration, you always knew that sooner or later they would accede to whatever request the Ukrainians made, disregarding the warnings from the Pentagon. Trump, who has gone out of his way to repeatedly to say that this is not his war, that he wants to extricate the United States from it, who seems to have far more skepticism about the war than Biden ever did, and who has within his team, within the White House team, people who are much more skeptical about the advisability of continuing the war than Trump himself is. I don't think Trump, in the end, is going to do it. And another reason why Trump should not do it is because Zelensky is quite straightforwardly telling us what he would do with the Tomahawk missile if it was ever supplied to him. He would strike Moscow. He would target government buildings in Moscow, the Kremlin presumably, the Council of Ministers building, the White House, the General Staff and Ministry of Defense buildings. Whereas the Russians, as I've discussed in recent programs, have generally avoided the approach of decapitation strikes against Ukraine. Zelensky is now quite open about embracing this idea. He has now openly spoken about and discussed it. He's even crowed that if there is a complete blackout of energy systems in Ukraine, the Ukrainians will launch their attacks on Moscow, and that the senior officials of the Russian government need to look out for themselves and remain close to their bunkers. Extraordinary language from Zelensky, and one of the things that really, I have to say, still astonishes me is that Zelensky can say these things. He can talk in this way. He can speak about escalation in this manner. And it goes completely unreported in the Western media. I remember how at the end of 2024, towards the second part of 2024, even as Zelensky was unveiling his so-called victory plan and dropping broad hints that he wanted Ukraine to acquire nuclear weapons and would not be sorry if the Americans provided him with some, I remember how muted the response to all of this was in the West. One would have thought that a leader who was prepared to talk in this way would be universally condemned as being utterly reckless and out of his senses. I can imagine how once upon a time the leadership of the United States in Congress and elsewhere would have responded in exactly that sort of way to proposals or ideas being floated by Zelensky of that kind. Not just the nuclear ideas that he was floating late last year, but also his proposals, his most recent proposals, his proposals now for cruise missile strikes against government buildings in Moscow. But hardly anyone says anything. In Congress, the old people, most of them are very old now, who still dominate the Senate, who've been there for years, who were brought up during the Cold War, who have who are hardwired to loathe Russia and to presume American primacy. Once upon a time, when they were younger, they might have been alarmed by this rhetoric. Today, it doesn't seem to concern them. They continue to look for all sorts of ways to heighten and escalate the confrontation. One never hears any criticism or any comment about proposals coming from Zelensky of this kind. And certainly one doesn't hear them from European governments either. Now, I assume, however, that the American government is perfectly well aware of what Zelensky would do or would want to do if Tomahawk cruise missiles ever were supplied to Ukraine. He would not, of course, Zelensky would not, of course, have actual control over these missiles, just as ATACMS and Storm Shadow and Taurus missiles can only be operated by input from Western military officials. The same is obviously truer still of the Tomahawk cruise missiles. The United States would retain tight control over them. But the fact remains that if they are deployed to Ukraine, Zelensky will demand and insist that they be used against targets in Moscow. He will point out that the United States itself has carried out decapitation strikes against various of its enemies or presumed enemies. The United States has recently supported and lent assistance to an attempted decapitation strike that Israel in June tried out against Iran. So Zelensky will say, why are you preventing me from conducting a decapitation strike against the Russian leadership? You're prepared to agree to do that with the Iranian leadership, but you seem reluctant to do that against the Russians. Whereas if you do what I want, if you enable me to take out Putin and Shoigu and Medvedev and Lavrov and all of those other people, your problems with Russia will finally be solved. Of course, the reality is that they would not be solved at all. They would suddenly get much worse. There is a high possibility that the Russians might respond in a way that leads to catastrophic consequences, not just for the United States and NATO, but for the whole of humanity. After all, they have that power, and they have fail-safe systems that the former president, Dmitry Medvedev, who is now vice chairman of Russia's Security Council, has alluded to. And I hope that for that reason, wiser heads in the Pentagon, in the United States government, in the White House will be strongly counseling the president against doing this thing. I don't believe he will do it. I don't think the president will do it. He's never shown any desire to escalate in this conflict in that sort of way. In this one respect, he has not up to now been the same as Joe Biden, and I hope, expect, and presume that he will not go down that route either. Anyway, Zelensky also floated, again, the possibility of negotiations, but whenever he talks about negotiations, it's quite clear that what he really means is Russian capitulation. And I noticed that once again, he ruled out categorically any territorial concessions. So with Zelensky, he goes on a high. He says that Ukraine is winning. He then falls to a low. He now says that Ukraine is not winning. It might even be losing. But his solution is not negotiations or concessions or anything of that kind. He talks again about missile strikes against Moscow, and ultimately decapitation strikes against the Russian leadership. In interviews, by the way, with the American media, he's also discussed his own future. He said that if there is peace, if there is a ceasefire, he would be prepared to stand down and to allow elections to take place. But of course, that is precisely why he does not want negotiations leading to which would lead not to a ceasefire, at least to an end to the conflict, precisely because he doesn't want to put himself in an election where he might lose power and have questions about himself finally asked. Now, that's Zelensky. I would point out that if Zelensky really did want to negotiate a resolution of the war, the means to do so are there. There's been 3 meetings between the Russian and Ukrainian negotiators in Istanbul. Those meetings have taken place despite Zelensky's own continued and adamant refusal to revoke the decree he issued in September-October 2022 forbidding direct negotiations with Russia. Just saying. But there have been 3 meetings. The Russians have suggested that the negotiating teams in Istanbul, meeting in Istanbul, be upgraded, and they've suggested setting up 3 working parties to explore possible ways to find compromises and to achieve diplomatic solutions. But of course, Zelensky is showing no interest in any of those things. And as I've discussed in recent programs, with Donald Trump now saying that Ukraine can win the war, the pressure, the political and diplomatic pressure on Zelensky to explore negotiations he truly is not interested in, that pressure has now gone. So anyway, that is Zelensky. Now, I spoke about Lukashenko being in Moscow, and Lukashenko also had very interesting things to say. He said that he listened together with Putin to an overall assessment of the military situation provided by the Russian General Staff, presumably by Gerasimov and his officials, perhaps the various commanders, group of forces commanders involved in the fighting in Ukraine also participated. That is very likely. Lukashenko said that there is a very good proposal for Ukraine on the table. It is the same proposal that the Russians have floated before, and about which they informed the Americans at the meeting in Anchorage. It's not difficult to work out that this is Istanbul Plus, the proposal that Putin outlined in his speech to the Russian Foreign Ministry on the 14th of June 2024, Ukraine's demilitarization, denuclearization, adoption, again, of neutrality and non-alignment, steps taken inside Ukraine to lift all discriminatory acts against Russian speakers, to restore Russian property and to restore the Russian Orthodox Church, steps taken to ban ultranationalist organizations and to effectively end their influence on Ukrainian political life. Anyway, and of course the 4 regions and the status of the 4 regions, recognition that the 4 regions now form part of Russia. And Lukashenko made the point that this is actually a good deal for Ukraine in the current circumstances. He pointed out that the deal that was offered to Ukraine in the first weeks of the war and which was initialed in Istanbul in April 2022 was much better. De jure, it would have left Donbass and all of the other territories, Zaporozhye and Kherson, still within Ukraine, though with their future status subject to negotiation. That, of course, that deal has now been lost. But in all the circumstances, it is still a good offer, and the alternative is to put at risk the very existence of Ukraine. As Lukashenko put it, if the Ukrainians refuse the deal, then they could lose Ukraine. It will be as it seemed in February 2022, when the Russians were outside Kiev, only this time it will be much worse, because the Russians will be far more powerful and far more implacable than they were at that time. And, of course, Lukashenko, when he says all of this, is absolutely right. And Lukashenko said that after he listened to the General Staff, the Russian General Staff's survey of the situation in the battlefields, he came away understanding fully quite how grave Ukraine's military crisis now is, that there is now a real risk that important populated centres, we'll come to that shortly, could soon be lost, and Ukraine might in that case be at genuine risk of losing its existence. And I have to say, as far as I'm concerned, he's basically right. That is indeed the situation, as we will see shortly, the situation as it is playing out on the battlefronts. Now, I don't think that this is well understood in Europe. I'm not even fully clear to what extent it is understood in the United States. I am aware that there is a view, again, that Donald Trump basically remains as committed, that the United States remains as committed to the proxy war with Russia as ever. I'm not myself of that view. I should say that straight away. But definitely the European members of NATO are. NATO certainly is. And of course the European leadership, Ursula von der Leyen and Kaja Kallas and all of the others, they remain so too. But you can see even within Europe that there are arguments. I discussed in my program yesterday how, despite the attempt by the European states to present a united front against the Russians in this extraordinary meeting which took place in Moscow, which I discussed in my program yesterday, about the alleged incursions of Russian drones and Russian fighter jets into European airspace. There continue to be divisions even on that issue. And there is now a bitter public row about the idea of confiscating Russian assets, the assets of the Russian central bank. So Ursula von der Leyen recently floated the idea that the Europeans, through some kind of joint bond, float a 170 billion euro loan for Ukraine, and that the loan be secured against the frozen assets of the Russian central bank, currently in Euroclear. As I understand it, the idea is that those assets, the funds, be transferred from Euroclear to some other special purpose vehicle. It's all very vague, but anyway, that is the idea. And they be kept there and reinvested in all sorts of mysterious ways. And but in the meantime, Ukraine obtained the loan. I have to say that if the assets are indeed going to be transferred out of Euroclear and placed in some other vehicle, and this is done without the agreement of the Russians, who are the owners and who deposited those assets in Euroclear in the first place, then that looks to me already like an act of confiscation. And moreover, I believe it is an act of confiscation. In other words, if the money or the assets are transferred out of Euroclear into some sort of mysterious special fund, I expect and believe that the assets and the money will vanish into that fund and will never be seen of or heard of again. They will in effect be confiscated. But anyway, Friedrich Merz, the Chancellor of Germany, who never misses the opportunity to come up with some kind of bad plan, whenever a bad idea is put to him, you can say with absolute certainty that Friedrich Merz is going to embrace it. Anyway, he wrote a piece in the Financial Times in which he said that the Germans are rightly very careful about property rights. They're deeply conservative about these things. And then, having said those things, he proceeded to contradict himself by immediately endorsing this wild, strange, bizarre plan that Ursula and the Europeans have just come up with. Well, not everybody is impressed. Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, has spoken out against it. I suspect that there is opposition within Germany itself, but the most outspoken criticism has come from the Prime Minister of Belgium, Bart de Wever. Euroclear is, of course, based in Belgium, and he's come out and said, de Wever has, that this scheme will never happen, that it would set a dangerous precedent, and that it would create grave consequences for Belgium and for the Eurozone as a whole. And he said, if countries see that central bank money can disappear, notice the word disappear, I just said that if the money is transferred out of Euroclear into a special purpose vehicle, it will vanish, it will disappear without trace, and that is exactly what de Wever obviously expects. If countries see that central bank money can disappear, if European politicians see fit, they might decide to withdraw their reserves from the Eurozone. Taking Putin's money and leaving the risks with us, that's not going to happen. Let me be very clear about this. So there's already an argument. There's arguments about whether to do things like this. We can see that the Europeans, they're all united, all the big countries are united about continuing the war. But without the Americans, without Joe Biden in the White House and Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken writing the checks and giving the endorsements and supporting the plans, they really have no plan or strategy about what to do. Some of them probably would support supplying long-range missiles to Ukraine, but notice that despite all the talk, all the claims about Taurus missiles having been supplied to Ukraine. Word circulating in the spring that they had been supplied, and then contradicted. And then a few weeks ago, about 3 weeks ago, we were hearing reports that the Taurus missiles were indeed in Ukraine and were about to be used, and notice that they haven't been used. Despite all of that, when it comes down to it, the Europeans have no real strategy. They're not prepared to engage in long-range missile strikes, or at least they haven't up to now been prepared to conduct long-range missile strikes against targets inside Russia. They cannot agree on shooting down Russian aircraft or fighter jets. And the reason for their uncertainty is because they are, on the one hand, intimidated by the steady and remorseless growth of Russian military power, as demonstrated by the presence of the Oreshnik in Belarus and the deployments of more Oreshniks in Western Russia, and by the growing size of the Russian military. So they're intimidated by that on the one hand, and at the same time, they are not really confident about the extent of the support they will get from the United States. Despite all of the talk about security guarantees, remember those? Remember how over the last couple of weeks we were hearing lots of talk and discussion about security guarantees? There were going to be meetings, in fact there were meetings between the Americans and the Europeans to discuss the security guarantees that the Europeans and the Americans were going to give to Ukraine, and the military backstop that the United States would offer to the Europeans if European troops were deployed in Ukraine. Well, intense discussions and activity about that. There was the meeting between the Europeans and Zelensky and Trump in the Oval Office, where all this dominated. We were told that, I think it was Mark Rutte, said that the issue, the exact nature of the guarantees would be resolved in a few weeks. Well, here we are. It's the end of September, and all talk of that has now evaporated, with the Americans clearly unwilling to give any kind of security guarantees at all. So all of that has evaporated. And given that this is so, the Europeans, very nervous of taking strong military steps against the Russians, conscious of their own weakness and unable to agree on freezing or seizing or confiscating Russian assets, because some of them, Belgium for example, France, are worried about the risks of doing so for themselves. So there is no agreement in Europe about any of these matters, and, well, one gets the sense that even as the military situation in Ukraine deteriorates, they're all over the place and have no real plan or strategy about what to do. Now, here perhaps I would just make one quick observation, and it's been made by a number of other people, but I think I would just repeat it, if only in order to endorse it, which is that the real paper tiger, in military terms, on the European continent is not Russia. Not at all. It is the European members of NATO. The Russian military now numbers several million men. According to Vladimir Putin, there are 700,000 Russian troops now fighting in Ukraine itself, 2014 Ukraine. Other sources that I know put the number higher. The Russians have extremely advanced weapons. They've got nuclear submarines. They've got long-range ballistic missiles. They've got hypersonic missiles. They've got Oreshnik missiles. They have massive numbers of precision-guided bombs. They have developed the technology for those. They have vast tank fleets and armored vehicle fleets and artillery systems. They are now, by universal consent, the world leaders in drone technology, military drone technology, having, as recently as 4 years ago, lagged badly behind the West in this area. They have leapfrogged the West, having assimilated the lessons of the war and sorted out the various production facilities. They've not just leapfrogged, they have surged far beyond the West. I recently read an article, I think it was by the British historian Niall Ferguson, by the way, who's just been to Ukraine, and he was talking about how nobody in Europe has a clear understanding of the kind of challenge that the Russian drones would cause in any military confrontation between a Western military, any European military, and the Russian, which did not go nuclear. So the Russian drones would swamp the skies. We've had articles in the New York Times which freely acknowledge that there are now so many of these drones, and Russian ability to produce drones is so enormous that Western air forces that tried to shoot them all down would be quickly swamped and would rapidly become depleted of their air-to-air missiles. They're highly expensive air-to-air missiles, which are very, very difficult to produce in large numbers. Compare that with the state of the militaries of the European countries. Britain, around 70,000 men, I believe. France, about the same. Germany, either slightly more or slightly less. But as I understand it, the German army has actually reduced in number over the last 3.5 years, despite all of the talk about rearmament in Germany. Tank production, apparently Germany's looking to produce, I believe it's 18 Leopard 2s over the next 3 years, over a 3-year period, 18. And it's not as if the Leopard 2s have proved such a great game changer on the Ukrainian battlefields. Anyway, Britain, no tank production to speak of at all. Artillery production, very depleted across Europe. Lots of claims about shell production having increased, but contradicted by industry sources, and a situation with air defense which is little short of disastrous. One of the reasons why the Russians have had to fight for so long in Ukraine is because whatever strength the Europeans have had, they have basically squandered by trying to reinforce Ukraine. It is consistently overlooked that in the conflict in Ukraine, even if the Russians have to fight Ukrainian soldiers, those soldiers are equipped, supported, supplied, their intelligence is provided by the nations of the West. The Russians, in other words, are up against, in effect, a coalition of Western states. And despite the fact that in Ukraine there have been hundreds of thousands of men who have been willing and ready to fight and die to fight against the Russians. Despite that, and despite all of this enormous inundation of support that Ukraine has received, the Russians are still winning. Now, if the Russians push through Ukraine, if they really had a plan to advance deeper into Europe, which thankfully they don't, it would be, I think, much easier for them. There's a lot of claims being made about the Finnish army. It's been said that because Finland operates a conscription system, Finland could rapidly call up 200,000 men to fight the Russian army, and they would be tough and strong and well motivated. Well, that of course might all be true, but I would point out that until just a few years ago, the universal consensus across the West was that relying on a conscription system in the way that the Finns do is bad military practice. You need full-time contract soldiers in order to have the necessary levels of training to wage modern war. And now, when the realities, the weaknesses of that system in Europe have been exposed, suddenly the conscript system, which, by the way, the Russians also, of course, have, suddenly that has its enormous advantages after all. One can see how the narrative constantly shifts depending on the circumstance. But regardless, even if Finnish soldiers are indeed as motivated, as well trained, and as numerous as people say, 200,000 is still far less than the Russian military can deploy. And of course, the Finns do not now have the experience and the depth of resources that the Russians do. The Russians have fought for 3.5 years. They understand the face of war, and in terms of advanced weapons, and in particular drone warfare, they have no rivals anywhere in the West. Even the United States at the present time cannot match them, and probably cannot match them anyway in a ground war. So that is the actual true military balance in Europe. It is all abstract and theoretical because, of course, NATO has nuclear weapons, as of course do the Russians. If there was that kind of a war in Europe, I cannot imagine that nuclear weapons would not be used. We would very, very rapidly escalate into a nuclear exchange, and I don't want to even talk about what that would mean. But certainly, it's a fallacy to think that the West is strong and the Russians are weak in military terms. And yes, the West does have a much bigger air force or combined air force than the Russians do. But I've been hearing reports about the state of the Royal Air Force, and I've read reports about the state of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, and, well, they do not make an entirely attractive picture, just saying. And there is no air defense system anywhere in Europe that can equal that which the Russians have. So anyway, that's what I wanted to say about this. Anyway, let's now turn to the military situation. And again, I'm going to do this relatively briefly, but I will say that yesterday, Radovka, which, as I said, is the most informative site that I know, providing us information about the state of the fighting in Pokrovsk, provided many more details about the fighting in northeast of Pokrovsk, in the area of the August breakthrough. And perhaps before I discuss this further, I would say that the Radovka for weeks now, basically since the start of the breakthrough in August, mirroring what other Russian sites do, refers to the fighting in this area not as part of the Pokrovsk battle, which is being conducted using different forces, but as part of what they call the Dobropilia direction. In other words, it's a battle that is supposedly centered on the battle to capture the town of Dobropilia, which is located to the northwest of Pokrovsk, and which is an important logistical hub for the Ukrainian army. Anyway, importantly, Radovka for the first time discussed the Ukrainian counterattacks and the ones that we've been hearing so much about. And it said that the Ukrainians have been attacking at the base of the area of the Russian breakthrough, both from the east and from the west, both from Shachova and from Belitskaya, in other words, and this is consistent with what many of the mapping projects have been saying. And the article said that the Ukrainians attacking from the east, from Shachova, were successful in reaching and occupying Vladimirovka, but that they are now being pushed back, and that the Ukrainian forces in this area are in a narrow salient, and that the Russians are pressing on them, and that their forces are becoming compressed, and that they are suffering, the Ukrainian forces are becoming compressed and are suffering very heavy losses. So the Russians, at least according to Radovka, have the situation on the eastern side of this pocket well under control. On the eastern side of the pocket, well under control. On the area of breakthrough, well under control. On the western side, it has been more difficult. And the Ukrainians have been attacking eastwards from the village of Belitskaya. And according to Radovka, they have managed to push the Russians back out of the village of Nikarovka, which the Russians captured back in August. Though Radovka says that because of the intense fighting, the intensity of the fighting and the Russian bombing and the massive presence of the Russian drones, the Ukrainians cannot consolidate in this village, and the Russians have been able to conduct counterattacks. So the way that Radovka describes the fighting in this area is of an intense encounter battle, but one which it appears to consider that the Russians continue to have the strategic initiative. And Radovka continues to claim that the Russians have encircled the Ukrainian troops in Rodinska, that they've now established a permanent physical presence on the supply road that passes through Rodinska into Pokrovsk, and that the Russians still have a significant belt of territory that they control west of this road, extending all the way to Grishinyo, further to the west. So I have spent a little time describing this because I think that this is probably the single most accurate account of what is going on in this area. An intense encounter battle, fluid front lines, the Ukrainians throwing everything they basically have to try to reverse the Russian breakthrough. But two Russian armies are now fighting in this area, the 51st and the 8th, and perhaps over time, Russian weight of resources is going to start to tell. Anyway, that's the situation according to Radovka. Now, elsewhere, we've been getting a lot more information about the situation in Pokrovsk. Yesterday, it was universally acknowledged, pretty much by all the mappers, as far as I can see, that Radovka's claim that the Russians control western Pokrovsk is true. And there's apparently now confirmation that the Russians have crossed the railway line that bisects Pokrovsk. It crisscrosses Pokrovsk from east to west and west to east, but the Russians are now beyond the railway and that they're attacking the industrial center to the north of the railway. And I don't know what the state of the battle there is, but anyway, it is now acknowledged. There was a Ukrainian soldier who appears to be based in this area, and he's written a report addressed to the Ukrainian command, which admits that the Ukrainian forces in southeastern Pokrovsk and in Mirnograd are unable to receive supplies and are running short of supplies. The soldier pleads for reinforcements and for steps to be taken to unblock the supply roads, and basically implies that unless this happens, resistance will not be able to continue in Pokrovsk and Mirnograd for much longer, and that the defenses in this area will finally and fully collapse fairly soon. And without, of course, giving a timeline. And this, by the way, is also consistent with further reports of further Russian advances from the east around Mirnograd. There's some reports that there are already Russian troops inside Mirnograd itself. This is the eastern suburb, the big eastern suburb of Pokrovsk, which the Russians call Dmitriev. Anyway, that's the situation in the Battle of Pokrovsk. The most intense, the most bitterly fought, and perhaps the most important battle of the war. And the fact that Zelensky is now becoming more low in spirits perhaps reflects the fact that the balance of the battle is steadily moving in Russian favor. Now, lots of things are happening elsewhere on the battlefronts as well. In the western Donbass, the Russians continue their advances. They seem to be now preparing for an attack on Novopavlivka, the big fortified village or small town in western Dnipropetrovsk region, and the Russian offensive in Zaporozhye region, eastwards from Donbass, has resumed, and it looks as if the Russians are taking the first steps to attack the important fortified positions of Uspenovka and Poltavka. These are two important big villages. If the Russians capture these two villages and the other big village in this area, Veliko-Mikhailovka, then the way is open for them to cut the supply roads to the town of Gulyapolye, further south, and then the position of the Ukrainian troops in Oreshnik becomes untenable, and then if Oreshnik falls, the entire territory of Zaporozhye region will come under Russian control effectively, apart from the city of Zaporozhye itself, which will then be under siege with the Russians close to the Dnieper. So this advance continues remorselessly, And there doesn't seem to be anything the Ukrainians can do to stop it or to slow it down. Elsewhere, further north, it looks as if even the Ukrainians are now admitting that the Battle of Kupiansk is lost. My sense is that the only reason that battle is continuing is because the Ukrainians in Kupiansk, their lines of retreat effectively have been cut off. I read yesterday an extraordinarily plaintive message by a Ukrainian soldier who speaks about a constant Russian reinforcements pouring into Kupiansk, capturing more positions, a flood of Russian soldiers which the Ukrainians cannot hold back. And, well, it's a complex battle, but again, nobody really doubts what the outcome will be. And further east, Liman, the battle there is probably a couple of weeks away still, the battle for that town, but the Russians have captured more villages there. And Siversk, the Russians claim to hold the northeast corner of Siversk. No corroboration of this, but there doesn't seem to be any doubt that the Ukrainians are gradually losing control of Yampol, the key village or position that enables the Ukrainians to receive, the Ukrainian garrison in Siversk to receive supplies, and it looks as if the Russians are moving closer to a village called Dronivka as well. It is likely, and it is now being openly discussed, that towns are going to start to fall in October. Going back to what Lukashenko was saying, he appears to expect a succession of populated places, Pokrovsk, Liman, Siversk, Kupiansk, perhaps even Konstantinovka, to start to fall one after the other, starting in October. And it seems to me that when that happens, it will no longer be possible any longer to deny that there is a military crisis for Ukraine on the battlefronts. And that could well apply to Gulyapolye in Zaporozhye as well. Bigger town, but it too might become undefendable and could perhaps also quickly fall. So anyway, that's the situation on the battle lines. Now, the American media is now speaking quite openly about plans being drawn by the United States for an attack on Venezuela, and I predict that this will happen at some point. I'm surprised, to be honest, that it hasn't happened already. The Russian and Chinese governments have again reiterated that they consider the reimposition of snapback UN sanctions against Iran illegal, and that they are intending to disregard those sanctions, that they're going to ramp up economic cooperation with Iran. The Americans have apparently told the Indians that there will be no deal with India, a trade deal with India, unless India gives up buying Russian oil. And the Indians apparently have responded by digging in their heels and by saying that this is not negotiable. So we could see lots of further confrontations starting to build. A crisis, a major crisis, is brewing in the Middle East. Prime Minister Netanyahu was badly received by most of the members at the UN General Assembly. There was whistles, apparently, and quite a few delegations walked out. But everywhere, in every place, we can see that tensions are growing. Surprisingly, the one area which, for the moment, continues to be relatively calm is the Asia-Pacific region, which is an enormous paradox because going all the way back to President Obama's pivot to Asia, that seems to be where the United States wants to focus its power. But as we see repeatedly, they're being pulled back, they're being drawn back into conflicts in all other places, all sorts of other places. The political situation and the economic situation in Europe continues to deteriorate. There are now open challenges to Keir Starmer's authority in Britain. And today, in an editorial in The Guardian, which has been one of the most stalwart supporters of Starmer up to now, appeared to transfer its loyalty to Andy Burnham, the Mayor of Manchester, who quite obviously is now intriguing to take Starmer's place. I'm not a particular fan of Andy Burnham, just to say, and I'm not going to discuss this further in today's programme. But political conflict and crisis is deepening. We have a fraught election in Moldova, where, by the way, the Maria Sandu government, or rather the Electoral Commission, which is, of course, largely controlled, as far as I can tell, by Maria Sandu's government, has now just banned 2 opposition parties in advance of elections, which are supposed to take place this weekend. Anyway, a stormy autumn, as I have said. The weather, the international weather, is growing worse, and there are mutterings about recession in the United States. So we live in interesting times, and I expect that the times are going to become still more interesting before very long. But this is where I finish my program today. Let me remind you, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.